Welcome to Part 7 of Murder and Marriage. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 19. Out of the Maze. Inspector Cowser looked at Mrs. Hull as if he thought she had lost her mind. You killed John Norby," he exclaimed, the others standing by in stunned silence. "Yes." Mrs. Hull instinctively tightened her grip on David Curtis's hand. His steady hold helped her maintain her composure. "But I didn't stab him on purpose. It was an accident." Stephanie stumbled over to her mother. "Mother," she stuttered, "you must be out of your mind." But as she caught the desperate look in Mrs. Hull's eyes, she turned in a sudden panic to Coroner Penfield. "I swear she's lost and unable to understand what she's saying." "Please, Stephanie, be quiet, dear." Mrs. Hull turned to Leonard de la Cruz with a pleading expression. "Help her calm down, doctor, while I explain what happened." De la Cruz gently guided the distraught girl out of the library, the startled staff parting to let them pass. As they reached the door, Franklin McDermott attempted to stop Stephanie, but upon receiving her glare of disgust, he backed away, covering his face with trembling hands. Sam Jackson, partially recovering from his shock, fetched a chair for Mrs. Hull. "Sit down," he said. "You look completely worn out." With a murmured thanks, she sank into the chair just as Brandi came over, kneeling and wrapping her arms around Mrs. Hull. "Excuse me, Coroner Penfield." Mrs. Hull struggled to steady her voice as she fought back the tears that threatened to blind her. "And you too, Inspector Cowser. If you could bear with me, I'll recount the dreadful events of Sunday night, and then I'll come along with you." She took a deep breath. "My husband has been facing financial troubles over the past 2 months," she continued. "I had some knowledge of his situation, but he didn't fully trust me with the details. It was around midnight on Sunday. Julian had turned in early, and I was just about to head upstairs when Franklin came to see me, telling me their firm was practically ruined. He suggested that I reach out to John Norby and seek his help. I'm a homebody, and the thought of starting over with a small house, little money, and no servants didn't scare me too much. But when I considered my husband and his pride in his business integrity, Stephanie, who had always lived in luxury and had her sights set on social ambitions, and those who had placed their trust in my husband and could suffer from his bankruptcy, I swallowed my pride and told Franklin that I would meet with John." Mrs. Hull paused, then continued at a slower pace. "Franklin insisted that I go to 10 acres right away, regardless of the time. He told me that unless he had a check for $50,000 or its equivalent in cash, the firm wouldn't be able to open its doors on Monday morning." Mrs. Hull sighed again. "I believed him, and he drove me there. It was after midnight, and Franklin let me in through the north door with his latchkey. He wouldn't come upstairs, but assured me he had tied a piece of twine to John's doorknob, so I wouldn't get lost." "But why all this secrecy?" Cowser asked. "Why didn't you just call to make an appointment for the next morning?" "Because I knew my husband and John weren't on speaking terms," she replied. "They had a falling out a week earlier. I wasn't confident that my husband would approve of my asking John for a favor, nor was I certain John would see me if I requested an appointment. I knew he had a habit of reading in bed half the night." She hesitated and glanced at Penfield. "Could I have a glass of water?" There was a brief pause while Damison rushed out of the room, returning an instant later with a glass in hand. Mrs. Hull drank eagerly, and after handing back the empty glass, she placed her hand on Brandi's shoulder as the girl knelt beside her. "I found John Norby sitting up in bed, a dressing gown draped over his shoulders, absorbed in a book. My sudden arrival took him by surprise. He listened to what I had to say with remarkable patience, then reached under his pillow and pulled out a key. "I have around $100,000 in cash stored in my safe here," he said. "I had plans to reinvest it, but I'm more than willing to lend Julian $50,000 to help him out. Will that be enough?" Mrs. Hull paused, clearly overwhelmed with emotion, while the others waited silently for her to continue. "In my nervousness while explaining my purpose to John, I picked up a sharp knife that rested on the open book beside him, which he had clearly used to cut its pages. Mrs. Hull stopped, her eyes clouding with horror as she relived the moment in her mind. I suffer from heart troubles, and the weight of the suspense along with John's generous offer proved to be too much for me. Suddenly I felt light-headed. I had been standing all this time and leaned forward, throwing out my left hand, still clutching the knife. John looked up, jerked back his head, and raised his hands to catch me. I swayed towards him, my left hand moved down, and the knife cut across his throat. Mrs. Hull broke down completely. When she finally looked up, Curtis was holding a glass to her lips. "Drink this," he urged, and she obediently swallowed the strong stimulant. "I'm almost done with my story, gentlemen," she gasped. The horror of what I had done snapped me back to reality, and I fled the room, desperate for help. I dashed down the hall but turned the wrong way, and in my panic, I ended up going down the back stairs into the reception hall. I was still holding the knife. In a moment of revulsion, I tossed it into one of the fern boxes, then went to the north door, slipped outside, and hurried over to Franklin's car, parked near the entrance to 10 Acres. "Was McDermott waiting for you in the car?" Curtis asked quickly. "No, I just had enough strength to climb into the car before I must have fainted," Mrs. Hull replied. "Hull, when I regained my senses, we were nearly home. Julian was asleep in his room, and no one heard me." With a struggle, she stood and gently loosened Brandi's grip. "That's all there is to it," she said. "But please, don't think I'm utterly wretched. I had no idea until just now that Brandi was suspected of killing her uncle. If I had known, I would have turned myself in to the police." "Cousin Claire, it was an accident," Brandi said firmly. "Surely, Inspector Cowser, you can't charge Mrs. Hull with murder." Cowser shook his head. "Mrs. Hull must come with me to headquarters and tell her story to the authorities. We need to consider manslaughter." "Wait," Curtis interjected, raising his voice to halt the inspector. "Before you go any further." In his urgency, Curtis stepped closer and stumbled over a footstool. He instinctively reached out and grasped the person next to him. "Mrs. Hull, the wound you accidentally inflicted did not cause John Norby's death." A cry escaped Mrs. Hull, and she wobbled on her feet, while everyone in the room stared at the blind surgeon in stunned silence. "I assisted with the autopsy," Curtis continued, speaking slowly and clearly. "My fingers are my eyes. They found a superficial gash on Norby's throat just above where the major blood vessels were severed." Mrs. Hull hung on his every word, her fearful expression transforming into one of growing hope. "I didn't kill John, thank God. Oh, thank God," she exclaimed breathlessly. "Doctor, you mean?" "That when you fled in a panic from the bedroom, followed by Norby, there was a witness to the scene. This witness," Curtis turned his head slowly, his sightless eyes searching the room, "caught up with Norby as he collapsed, half unconscious, at the top of the staircase, and then bent down to cut Norby's throat." In the heavy silence, Brandi noticed her mother's sharp intake of breath. Turning slightly, she saw Mrs. Norby watching Curtis with an intense fascination, seemingly unaware that her fingers were twitching nervously around her scented handkerchief. Inspector Cowser's harsh voice snapped Brandi back to the present. "Who was this witness?" he demanded. "The man who arranged the interview, Franklin McDermott." As soon as his name was spoken, McDermott struggled to free his wrist from Curtis's tight grip. "You're lying, damn you, you're lying," he stammered, his face pale and trembling. "You have no evidence." "Ah, but your face tells a different story," Cowser asserted, gesturing to McDermott's contorted expression as the man recoiled from him. "Release him, Dr. Curtis." Slowly, Curtis let go. "Your pulse gave you away, McDermott, when I mentioned that there were 2 wounds on Norby's throat," he said. "Thinking you were completely safe from suspicion after Mrs. Hull's confession, the shock was too much for you to handle." "It's a lie, McDermott repeated, his lips dry as his frantic gaze scanned the room. He made a sudden move toward the library window, but Detective Sergeant Brown intercepted him, knocking the razor from his hand. In an instant, McDermott found himself staring blankly at a pair of handcuffs hanging from his wrists. "A useful weapon," Brown remarked, picking up the razor. "So the razor was the culprit in Norby's case, right, McDermott?" McDermott only snarled in response before sinking into a chair. Before Curtis could say anything, Brandi turned to face Coroner Penfield. "I did visit Uncle John's room late Sunday night," she said. "Mother had told me about his plan for me to marry Dr. Curtis." She avoided looking at Curtis. "I went to convince him to reconsider. At first, Uncle John was harsh and said some hurtful things." She hesitated, coloring deeply as she caught her mother's disapproving glare. "Years ago, when they first entered business, my father and Uncle John were junior partners in Turner and Waterman stockbrokers." An exclamation from Curtis interrupted her. "The firm went under," he said, "and my father, Dan Curtis, who had entrusted his financial affairs to it, lost everything in the collapse. He took his own life." "That's what Uncle John told me," Brandi said quietly. "He mentioned that neither my father nor he ever truly got over that tragic death. They tried desperately to find your mother and offer her financial help, but she—" "Returned to her parents in Canada," Curtis interjected. "I grew up in the remote Northwest, raised by trappers who taught me not to rely solely on sight. They showed me how to use my hearing and my reasoning to find my way. That training has been invaluable given my current condition," he said, touching his sightless eyes. "After my mother's death, I attended McGill Institute and worked to pay my way through college. The rest of my life, you already know." "Uncle John figured out who your parents were and went straight to Walter Reed Hospital," Brandi continued. "He took an immediate liking to you and invited you here." Her cheeks flushed again. "He came up with the idea of our marriage as a way to make amends." "How considerate of him," Mrs. Norby remarked dryly, feeling she had remained in the shadows long enough. Her emotions were in a whirlwind from the rapid developments. "Please, continue your story, Brandi." "I left Uncle John in anger." Brandi's voice cracked slightly, the emotional weight evident. "But I couldn't sleep. I felt compelled to tell him I agreed with his plan." She bit her lip and turned slightly away from Curtis. "When I reached his room, I encountered Uncle John, and his ghastly appearance shocked me. As he staggered past, he pressed a key into my hand, whispering, 'Keep this, Brandi.' But when he spoke my name, his voice rose as he added, 'I've caught you, you devil.'" Ruffles, the parrot, echoed his cry as Uncle John vanished down the dim corridor. Dazed by the situation, I hesitated for a moment, then began to follow him when a handkerchief was pressed to my face, and I was carried into Uncle John's bedroom. "By Franklin McDermott," Curtis stated. He turned toward the silent figure slumped in the chair. "Why did you use Brandi's handkerchief to chloroform her?" McDermott shifted and looked up, anger simmering in his eyes. His initial refusal to answer changed when Brown gave a firm tug at the handcuffs. "The handkerchief, along with Norby's razor, was sitting next to a bottle of chloroform on Norby's bureau by the window where I entered," he finally confessed, shifting uncomfortably in his seat to escape Mrs. Hull's gaze. "I thought Brandi had seen me in her uncle's room. As she passed out, I hurried down the hall and caught Norby." He inhaled sharply and tremors coursed through him. "Never mind the details. I managed to get back to the bedroom." "And chloroformed the parrot as well?" Curtis asked. "Yes, I was worried that pesky bird would wake everyone up. I had overheard Mrs. Hull talking to Norby after quietly making my way down the back stairs to my room, and then along the balcony to Norby's open window. I heard him mention the money in the safe, and rushed in to grab the key to his secret compartment just as he stumbled into the hallway, clearly chasing after Mrs. Hull. It occurred to me that if I took the money, they would suspect Mrs. Hull, and oh God, how I needed that money." His voice cracked, rising with desperation. "I knew our firm was on the brink of collapse, and with $100,000 in cash, I could escape the country. I searched Norby's body." Another shudder rippled through McDermott, and he wiped the sweat from his forehead with his coat sleeve. "Then I searched his room. Where did you hide the key, Brandi?" "In the cuff of my dressing gown," Brandi replied. "When I came to, my only thought was to follow Uncle John, so I went down the corridor and found his body." She looked at Penfield. I got my hair caught on that button while trying to check if Uncle John was still alive. And later, you caught me trying to get rid of the hair. Why didn't you confide in me? Penfield asked. His tone was gentle, and Brandi felt tears well up in her eyes. I was scared, she admitted. I understood that you suspected me of murdering Uncle John, and I didn't know how to prove my innocence. One more question, Penfield said, closing his notebook. How did your fingerprints end up on the scalpel? I found the knife under the ferns and put it back where I found it, she explained. I thought Uncle John had lost his mind and taken his own life, and I assumed he had tossed the knife through the banisters. Penfield stood up and buttoned his coat. I must commend you, Dr. Curtis, on your skillful handling of this case, he said. Without you, Mrs. Hull would be facing arrest for a terrible crime. Curtis couldn't see the look of deep gratitude on Mrs. Hull's face. How can I express my feelings? She started, her words tumbling out in confusion. The torment of thinking I was responsible for John's death, Doctor. How can I thank you? Please don't, Curtis said, flustered. I never suspected you, but I did entertain the thought that your daughter, Stephanie, might have been driven to rob Norby and was guilty of an even worse crime. Norby told me that her engagement to McDermott was long-standing. He also mentioned that there were rumors about the firm of Hull and McDermott facing financial troubles, and while he had no proof, he was convinced it was McDermott's shady practices that endangered Colonel Hull. Curtis paused for a moment, clearing his throat. When you recounted how you stabbed Norby, he continued, I realized that while it would bleed heavily, such a wound wasn't necessarily fatal, and my focus shifted to McDermott. He could have seen the scene you're unaware of. Curtis paused again. I knew he was right here with me, and pretending to steady myself, I placed my fingers over his pulse while I tested my theory. Nice work, Doctor, Inspector Cowser said with admiration. But what led you to Miss Stephanie Hull? Gretchen told me this morning that Stephanie was her young Mies, and I remembered how the maid acted during the inquest. Mrs. Hull sometimes has a tone in her voice that's similar to her daughter's, which explains why Gretchen confused the identity of the woman she saw under her window, Curtis explained. But it was Suzanne who gave me a hint about where Norby was keeping his well-hidden safe. I need to talk to Suzanne. Monsieur, I am here. Suzanne, who had been hanging back in the room, stepped forward. Why were you in Mr. Norby's bedroom? Curtis asked. And why were you on your knees? If it pleases Monsieur, Suzanne began, nervously twisting her apron as she met Mrs. Norby's sharp gaze. I heard Madame Norby talking to herself about a key and how Monsieur John's wealth was locked away in his room. So, Monsieur, I went to his old bedroom early this morning to look for the key and return it to Madame. She said this with calm assurance, and I was searching on my knees for it. I had the key until last night, Brandi admitted. When I took it from you, Curtis started. You, but Brandi's shout was drowned out by an even louder cry from McDermott. So you got to it first, he exclaimed. I followed Brandi's car, hoping to get a chance to take it from her. You were the masked man. The realization hit Brandi as Curtis glanced back and forth between them. Yes, I drove by and parked my car on the left side of the road when I saw you had stopped, McDermott explained. I fashioned a mask out of the lining of my coat. I had a feeling, Curtis, that Brandi had given you the key and was just putting on a show when she said it was missing. So I used the monkey to check if you were awake before I stepped into your room last night. You had a tight grip on his paw, Curtis, and I had no choice but to take the only way to free him, he said, shooting an unfriendly look at Jocko, who was settled comfortably in the big armchair. Did you have that monkey in my room yesterday, McDermott? No, monsieur, that was me, Suzanne interjected. I had brought him from Mademoiselle Brandi's room. Jocko doesn't like the parrot. He escaped me in the hallway and ran into your room. Before I could catch him, he soiled your counterpane, and I changed it afterward. Leonard de la Cruz, who had quietly slipped into the library minutes earlier, couldn't help but smile. Well, that clears up that mystery, he said. But what about the white hairs around the button on Norby's jacket, Curtis? I saw Tiaska an hour ago, the blind surgeon replied. He admitted he lied about their color and stole them from my wallet, thinking he was protecting Brandi. He also said that you, McDermott, cut the string from my doorknob and scared him into lying. Tiaska isn't the bravest person. He overheard your conversation with Jim Narlin, the infamous con man, also known as Frank Elliott. McDermott stood up so suddenly that he knocked over his chair. I'm leaving, he declared. Not without me, Detective Sergeant Brown said, appearing at his side with his revolver drawn. McDermott turned pale and bit his lip. With his shoulders slumped and head down, he followed Inspector Cowser and Brown out of the library. The three men, alongside Coroner Penfield, led him through the reception hall and out of the house, with Suzanne and Damison, still eager for answers, trailing behind. Mrs. Hull, upon a quiet signal from de la Cruz, also hurried from the room. Curtis took a few restless steps back and forth, knowing he still had an unpleasant task ahead of him. Mrs. Norby, he began, stopping beside her. Did you turn off the light in the hallway on Sunday night, right after I found John Norby's dead body? I did, Brandi replied quickly, cutting off her mother. I had this crazy thought, after I found poor Uncle John, that I needed to sneak back to my room without being seen, so I turned off the light. I ran into Mother right at the entrance to our bedroom. Hold on, Brandi. I need to confess something. Mrs. Norby's voice was smooth and calm, carrying an air of grace that momentarily masked her deeper intentions. It dawned on her sharp mind that the blind surgeon might be someone she needed to appease. She noticed Brandi's anxious expression, Curtis' slight, cynical grin, and met Leonard de la Cruz's curious gaze with bold confidence. I saw Dr. Curtis and Sam leave John's room in a hurry down the corridor. Surprised by their behavior, I went into my brother-in-law's bedroom. On the bed, I found several papers. I took the prenuptial agreement, Brandi, to protect your interests. Brandi turned pale. Mother. It's safely stored away, she continued, ignoring Brandi's reaction. When it's needed, I'll provide it. And the codicil to Norby's will, Curtis interjected swiftly. You have that too. There's no point in denying it, he added as she opened her mouth to protest. Both documents need to be given to Jackson today, madam. If you prefer, I can deliver them along with $100,000 in cash, suggesting they were placed in the safe by Norby. Very well, I will hand them over, on one condition. No conditions, madam, he replied firmly. I have no intention of pursuing this any further. As far as I'm concerned, I will never mention it again. Nor will I, Mrs. Norby shot back defiantly as she brushed past Curtis and exited the room. De la Cruz broke the awkward silence by walking over to the chair and lifting Jocko into his arms. I'll take care of this little one, Brandi, he said. Stephanie is resting quietly in her room with her mother, and Gretchen is looking after her. Colonel Hull's injuries from his car accident last night include a broken arm and a collarbone. I'll see you both later. With that, he discreetly slipped away. Curtis fumbled with his cane, feeling miserable in the quiet. He had unraveled the mystery of John Norby's death, but like many fulfilled desires, this discovery brought him a sharp pang in his heart. He felt honor-bound to release Brandi from her promise to marry him, but how could he walk away without confessing his deep feelings for her? Love had disregarded the short time they had known each other. Brandi had nestled herself into his heart, destined to remain there forever. Was he really expected to leave her in silence? The minutes dragged on as pride fought fiercely with love. Brandi, he suddenly said, stopping in front of her where she sat watching him intently. I cannot, in good conscience, hold you to your promise. Your uncle's idea that we marry as a form of restitution was unfair to you. I respect you immensely, and I value our friendship. He kept his voice steady, forcing calm within. Without a career, I feel I have no right to ask you to share your life with me. I am not worthy. Worthy? How could he be so blind? Was this calm and friendly regard all he could offer to her aching heart? Her lonely childhood and her mother's cruel neglect had culminated in her finding solace with him. Was this man, who had shielded her in her time of need, and who had won her affection with his bravery and kindness, destined to fade from her life? She lifted her gaze, and had Curtis been able to see the yearning in her eyes, his stubborn pride would have crumbled. Brandi rose slowly to her feet and placed both hands on his shoulders. "Dave," she whispered, her lips trembling even as she smiled, "I can't ask you to break your promise because—" she hesitated, "because—" He pulled her into a close embrace. At last, the walls of false pride were put aside. "My dear, dear Brandi," he stammered, "please tell me, sweetheart, because—" "I love you," and Brandi, glancing shyly up at his changed expression, knew she had finally found her happy place. The end. The End. This concludes Murder and Marriage by Merrick Sharp, narrated by Chris Michelson. Published by brooksaudiobooks.com. All rights reserved. No portion of this audiobook may be reproduced in any form without written permission of the publisher. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks, and be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released.